the housekeeping's a little different for an in-person meeting. I gotta get used to this again, where we talk about like restrooms are out in the hall and sign-up sheets are out in the hall also. So please take some time to sign up. And for those that are participating online, please mute your microphones. There will be an opportunity for comment later on in the meeting, at which time we'll be queuing you up. So the purpose of that, though, the participants online could either, be making a comment on a topic, or there could be a public comment that folks want to make. For folks in the room here wanting to make public comments, there are public comment cards out on the sign-in desk, and so we'd ask that you fill those out in advance. And if somebody wants to do something via Zoom, raise your hand, enter a comment into the chat box that you intend to make, that you'd like to make a public comment. So one other thing that I should mention is because this is a hybrid meeting, if folks on the committee would like to make a comment, please turn your microphones on so you can be heard on the Zoom call. And yeah, with that, we can start with self-introductions. My name is Mike Vanderhoff, IDOT Planning. We'll go this direction.
Hi, everyone. Julia Friedel, Metra.
David Kralik from Metra, and just so no one thinks we're double counting on the committee, I'm going to have to leave early, and so Julia will be taking my spot when I have to leave.
Hi, I'm John Loper. I'm representing the counties today for Sydney and Scott Hennings. Thank you.
Mike Clemens, representing the Council of Mayors.
Hi, my name is Buck Doyle. I represent CDOT.
Christina Vader with CTA.
Heather Mullins with the Regional Transportation Authority.
Dave Tomzik, Pace Bus.
Alex Ensign with CMAP.
Do you want to introduce yourself, Kama?
Sure, Kama Dubs with CMAP.
Martin Menninger with CMAP.
Noah Harris with CMAP.
Ryan Elke, CMAP.
George Rivera, CMAP.
Stephanie Pfeiffer, CMAP. Good to see everybody in person.
Amy Lee, CMAP.
Hi, I'm Heidi Lichtenberger with Kane Kendall Council of Mayors.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Who do we have on Zoom, Ryan?
On Zoom, we have Penny Duvernay, Alicia Gage, Brandon Gieber, Eric Jarnota, Jack Malik, Jackie Forbes, Jessica Abdul-Noor, John Donovan, Kendra Johnson, Chris Skogsbacken, Michael Fricano, Peter, and Tony Greep.
Excellent. Great attendance. And yeah, thanks everybody for coming in person today. And thanks for everybody who's dialed in online. So next on the agenda, we have agenda changes, and we have a quorum, by the way. We just needed 5. Next on the agenda, we have agenda changes and announcements. Does anybody have any agenda changes or announcements? CMAP staff, any changes to the agenda? Okay, well then let's move on to approval of the minutes. Folks have been supplied a copy of the minutes from the last meeting. I was wondering if anybody's got any comments on those minutes. This would be for May 10th, 2023. Well, hearing none, do we have a motion to approve the minutes as presented?
So moved, David Kralik.
In a second.
I'll second.
Is there any discussion? Hearing none, we'll have a voice vote. All those in favor of accepting the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Hi.
All opposed, say no. The motion carries. Minutes are approved. So next on the agenda, this is a good one. I'm glad this is on here. Committee member updates. In previous meetings, probably about a year ago, folks indicated a desire to hear about some of the competitive projects that have gone out and are either are or aren't underway, kind of a status report thing, so that the committee can can understand how they're going and maybe hear about the good work being done. And so today, Metra is going to be providing an update on previously awarded funds for the Metra Sustainability Plan. So we're going to hear from Dave Kralik.
So thank you for the opportunity to present a little bit on this. My colleague Julie Friedel and I will be presenting to you about Metra Sustainability Plan and kind of how we came to this process. So next slide, please. So this may be a new concept for a lot of you because back in 2020, I went back to my notes today and confirmed that it was March 11th in 2020 that we learned that we were awarded $236,000 from the FY 2021 UWP competitive program for Metra's Downtown Connection Study. There was something that happened the following week that changed things a little bit for us. I can't remember exactly what that was, but suffice to say that our plans for studying all the connections downtown were put on hold for a while. And we're still at a point where there's not enough clarity and enough stability in the understanding of return to work, of return of shuttle connections to really, we feel, move forward on this study at this point. So we know we had funds that were getting old in the program and funds that were soon to be expiring. And there's another activity that we felt really would better address the current shape and the current needs from this. And so that is with climate change being a more apparent and more central focus of our efforts, of our response to large discretionary grant programs, of our interaction with the rest of the transportation system and the transit system specifically. We had conversations with CMAP about repurposing those funds to lead in our development of a sustainability plan. So Julie's going to take you through a little bit more about what we're going to do with these funds, how we're going to approach this, how this will connect with all of you, but wanted to be able to present this to the committee and share with you all how we're planning to take these competitive funds, move them forward, and be able to deliver a result that we think will have regional benefit, not just to us as an agency, but benefits that we can share and with the rest of the group. So next slide, please.
Thank you, and hi, everyone. Does this work? Okay. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today and to present you the path towards Metra Sustainability Plan funded by the UWP funds. I guess we here on the table can all agree that we can only tackle climate change by promoting the model shift from private cars to transit. However, according to CMAP data, in 2015, Metra emitted around 331 tons of carbon emissions, which is 32% of the region's railway emissions. So we as Metra also want to do our part. We want to reduce the emission we produce. We want to bundle all the sustainability activities within the agency. So we want to scale up our service while drawing down harmful emission, and that's what we are planning to do with this sustainability plan. A brief overview, the total project costs will be 295K with a UWP grant of 236K, and the sustainability plan will be finalized in April 2024. The general objectives of the plan, first, we want to establish a greenhouse gas emissions inventory and methods to measure decarbonization. In doing so, we want to help contribute to CMAP's commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within the region. In addition, we also want to address climate risk scenarios and also climate resiliency in order to protect our investment to climate change. And finally, the plan should also help Metra to pursue federal grants to implement a new sustainable infrastructure, to acquire cleaner rolling stock, not only to realize regional drain, but also to improve access to opportunity, racial equity across the CMAP region. Next slide, please. The major tasks and the schedule. First, We wanna create a set of understood practices for capturing, measuring, and tracking Metro's emission data. And we also wanna define a linkage to our strategic plan. This should be finished in the first quarter of 2024. Second, the current state of Metro's sustainability should be determined, as well as benchmarks identified to develop a roadmap. Third, a program will be developed defining the metrics and all the data needs. And next, we want to go into more detail and really create and later also maintain an emissions inventory. And this data will also provide more sophisticated inputs for CMAP's regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory. This task should be completed by the end of 2024. These findings should be further translated into an ESG, an environmental social governance framework, to also meet state-of-the-art sustainability reporting standards. Metro's sustainability plan would also include a climate resiliency and vulnerability analysis, but please note that this task is not part of the UWP funds, and Metro is currently seeking additional funding to conduct an in-depth risk assessment of our assets. Finally, the sustainability plan will be adopted and published in the second quarter of 2025. Additionally, we will provide quarterly process reports to the CMAP staff and also present updates to this committee. Next slide, please. To sum up, I want to talk briefly about the alignment with the regional goals. First, implementing the sustainability plan, Metro will also do its part to reduce the region's emission, bolster climate resilience, and also help prepare the region for climate change. We also help that by informing our current but also future riders about the benefits of sustainable transportation to promote a model shift and to boost the region's model shift to transit. And second, the sustainability plan will address all three pillars of sustainability, which are social equity, economic viability, and environmental protection, and thereby aligning perfectly with the UNTO 2050 principles. Following this state-of-the-art ESG guidance, such as Global Reporting Initiative, we will also address environmental impacts, economic development, and human services. And the plan would include, among other things, strategies for energy consumption, emission reductions, and economic impacts. The project will further include, as mentioned before, capturing and maintaining of emissions data and really tracking measurable goals. And thereby we are in alignment with the goals set by FDR, FRA, CMAP, and the Chicago Climate Action Plan. Finally, the sustainability plan will, of course, be built on Metric's strategic plan by identifying strategies to reduce emission and to promote the model shift. To sum up, who will benefit from Metro's sustainability plan? First and foremost, of course, the residents of the Chicago region by the improved air quality, but secondly, also CMAP, this committee, and our partners by the enhanced data we are providing, and also the lessons learned within this process. So that's it, and yeah, please feel free to ask any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Julie and David. Does anybody have any questions? I guess I have one or two. Do you know of any other organizations similar to yours that have done this kind of study? I mean, we do a lot of planning studies statewide, and one of the things that I probably need to try to do better is try to improve coordination between the studies. So there could be, beneficial use for a lot more than just you all. So have you found anything anywhere else yet, or?
We did a little research into peer transit agencies that had done this. We didn't necessarily look through all that. Do you want to?
SEPTA has been doing that, and that's like one of our peer groups.
One of the ones we modeled really as we were scoping this out. SEPTA in Philadelphia was a key, provided a lot of analogs for us to follow in that. But I think there's, and I know there's work that some of the other agencies in the state have done that will be complementary within this, but may not be exactly the same realm that we've done. And definitely, we think that having both the overall analysis, but the more detailed greenhouse gas estimation will help us to better understand our own part in this and better understand how we can, as we're looking to the concrete benefits of changes that we make with our rolling stock and other decisions, and what those are going to be on the climate.
Excellent. So I appreciate, and I'm sure the other committee members appreciate sort of the recognition and realization that the study as originally scoped wasn't gonna work the way you all had originally envisioned it, and you're making a decision to rescope it. I guess question for CMAP staff, is that require a decision or an approval on your part, or review, or any kind of action by the committee?
In my non-expert opinion, no.
Okay, I just thought I'd check.
That was the advice that we'd gotten from CMAP. So we're not necessarily, we wanted to make sure that we weren't doing this, having this change of direction happen without informing the committee, and wanted to make sure that you all were aware of it, but also really wanted to have the opportunity to really answer any questions that may come up related to that.
Excellent.
If I could chime in, we did confirm with our finance department and look at the original contractual agreement, and then confirmed with IDOT that the change was acceptable. So it was something staff was able to manage.
Kama, can you ask any questions? Go ahead.
Two questions. One, will you have a technical advisory committee? And two, how does this align with the work that the RTA is getting ready to do?
So one, in the scope, we've not, since the focus is going to be on our work, we are setting up an internal technical advisory committee, but we at this point had not envisioned pulling others into that. We will be able to present results from that coming out. And second, relation to RTA's efforts, that was your question. So we think that this very clearly aligns with the work that with the goals laid out in Transit is the Answer, and we'll be coordinating this with the implementation activities that come out of that. So as they're looking to develop an overall regional sustainability effort, that this will kind of feed into that and provide some more detailed analysis than I think to our understanding than RTA was planning to embark on.
I'm not really questioning the viability or the project and the rescoping. Just kind of questioning whether or not this really sets up a precedent for future methodology changes here, in terms of extension of contracts, extension of projects through the UWP process. I know this is one of the items that was included within the methodology is timeliness of project delivery. So I just want to make sure that everybody, knows or understands kind of where we are as it relates to that issue.
And, I just in response to that, I would echo that clearly it's our original intent was to complete the downtown connections. While we can't, I don't think any of us can predict the timing and duration of the next pandemic and the next kind of unexpected broad scale change to this. It was really, it's not intended to be any sort of misdirection or something that we asked for one thing with an intention of changing course along the way. This was really not having full information going forward and being in a position where we were kind of pausing on the downtown connection study for as long as we felt was reasonable, but we still didn't feel like we had enough stability in the market to really understand what that new piece is. We're also undertaking several other efforts that have some overlapping elements in our current route restoration study and system-wide network plan, which are going to be changing a lot of things, have the potential to change not only current Metro schedules, but also the overall framework of our operations as we shift to a regional rail model that we feel would be important to understand the broader system implications before we can delve more deeply into what's happening downtown. So we think by delaying that downtown connection study to a point after investigating that further after we're further along in the route restoration and system-wide network plan seemed more logical, but that would be a time frame that would extend, still indefinitely at this point and extend beyond the time frame of the UWP.
And again, and also I guess in 21 and 22, we didn't have a competitive program. It was all core. So I think this is a one-off that we're trying to catch up, solve, salvage a project and a funding source. And then, so I don't think it sets precedent that the other mechanisms are in place for the competitive to keep it on track and recorded and monitored. But I think just the unique situation that we had with this, where the world stopped essentially in transit and travel patterns, that it is providing some very good benefit on the climate change element, and it is needed. So I think it's a valid change to make.
I wouldn't dispute that. I would acknowledge the point, though, that if maybe it's something that CMAP should consider making sure is addressed in program guidelines. This would not be the first study that had to pivot, because of COVID, maybe the scope's changing sort of entirely, or at least, large percentage, but probably something to have in the program guidance, how that stuff is reviewed and approved or denied, that kind of thing. Buck, did you have something?
Yeah, I have a question. Sustainability is a pretty nebulous term, and you spoke a lot about climate change, rightly so, of course. Would you tell me a little bit more about the elements of the non-climate change related stuff, that you guys plan to include? I see social responsibility organization, but also within the scope of your organization.
Sure. Maybe let me reiterate. So what we are planning to do is addressing all the 3 pillars of sustainability, which are not only environmental protection, but also social equity and economic viability. And in doing so, and there is also within this ESG guidance, we also have to address these 2 other pillars. And we want to follow the global reporting initiative, which also following this, you have to address all of these other factors as well, which is racial equity. And there's I think 50 indicators you have to address within this framework. So we really make sure to really have the full picture. That's why we also we had this discussion internally, and we were really focusing and wanted to do not only the environmental plan, not only the climate action plan, but and answer all the 3 pillars of sustainability. So to get the full picture. So we are really aware of that and try to follow that. Also following this international standards, which are also
And Julie brings a wealth of experience to us. She's relatively new to the Metro team, but comes from having experience working on sustainability issues and on infrastructure issues with European Parliament and with the Austrian government previously. And so I think we as staff we've had a pivot within our own team of our formerly known safety group has expanded to involve the environmental sustainability focus for them, and Julie, as well as some other folks who we brought online recently, are helping lead us in that broader view of sustainability, to not be just solely focused on climate change and resiliency, but the other pillars as well.
Yeah, so giving my background, when I'm talking about sustainability, I'm always talking about the 3 pillars, and that's a discussion we also had to have in our organization. Yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. And again, it sounds like a good idea. It's going to help you all better understand and position yourselves for the future, and in particular, the new sort of bunch of federal and state grant programs that are coming out with this focus area. So hopefully it helps you identify what your first and your next steps are and puts you in a good position to go for projects. So anybody else have any questions on this topic? Are there any other grant recipients from recent or past competitive programs that would like to give updates on their projects today? And if not today, maybe we can talk into a future meeting for like a summary update or things like that. Not necessarily we want to change the scope of the project, but things are going great type of report, or, just anything that you might think that the committee would find interesting. So thank you again. Yeah, no problem. So next on the agenda, we're going to hear some new business. CMAP's prepared a UWP program development methodology. It's been included in the meeting packet. So folks should have that in hand and probably have certainly already reviewed it in detail. And just to fill gaps, we'll let Kama give a talk about what's in that memo.
All right, thank you. And I didn't have the microphone close enough to me yesterday, so I'm trying to do better today. If I fade out, somebody signal me. Just before I kind of dive into what I prepared to say, thanks, John, for bringing that up about the scope change. I think that's exactly the kind of things that we want to work into what I'll call active program management procedures. We do that in all of our other funding programs, and I think it makes sense. It helps us keep projects on track. And as we're, jumping to the end of the presentation here, if we're talking about a multi-year competitive program, having those kinds of procedures, with a multi-year program, that gives us some space to pivot when things like this happen and to make the decisions to, put a pause on one project and bring another project forward. So absolutely, that kind of thing will be written into those procedures that hopefully we'll be talking about at our next meeting. So with that, I think at the committee's last meeting, we did spend some time kind of refreshing our perspective on the UWP by discussing what planning activities are required for the MPO and starting to brainstorm how we can refocus our core program and provide a consistent and predictable competitive program. Next slide. So as explained in the packet memo, staff has been working to develop recommendations for revisions to the core program development process. We've conducted a peer review and have developed a set of ideas for revisions to the competitive program for committee discussion. In order to ensure that the MPO is meeting federal requirements through our planning activities and products, next slide. Staff proposes a core program that is for specific ongoing core work, not so much one-time studies, that is completed by either staff at CMAP or staff at our partner agencies, using a budget that's based on staff hours and rates plus eligible expenses to complete that work. We're not suggesting that consultant work would be totally banned from the core program, but it should be pretty limited, in part due to the need really to just keep core activities on track strictly within each individual federal fiscal year, not federal fiscal year, state fiscal year. So the core work is proposed in these 6 categories, which not surprisingly align with what we reviewed at our last meeting. The TIP, the long range plan, the congestion management process, performance monitoring, public participation, and the MPO's operational activities and expenses. Core work should be completed by these eligible partners. That is everybody sitting around this table. There is an asterisk here on the Council of Mayors because I did want to spend a minute talking about kind of their unique role in our region, because they're partners like the counties and the transit agencies are, but they also function quite a bit as an extension of CMAP staff. So with the 284 municipalities in the region, CMAP does rely heavily on the staff of the councils of mayors to be the liaisons between CMAP and those municipalities. The structure of the councils allows more municipalities to have a broader, more meaningful discussions about CMAP related topics at the sub-regional level that could never occur if we had to engage with all of them individually. The planning liaisons at the councils also act as an extension of CMAP's programming staff, providing project implementation oversight and assistance to local agencies that CMAP would otherwise need to hire staff to provide. Therefore, within the core UWP activities, the councils have a very specific scope of work that includes some additional responsibilities and activities that maybe our other planning partners don't have. The councils themselves are also not taxing bodies. They don't generate their own revenue. Instead, they operate within other bodies, sometimes within county DOTs or within nonprofit councils of governments. And so while those bodies can provide match for the federal transportation funding, because they don't generate revenue, the councils are eligible to use core UWP funds for funding the operational expenses and commodities necessary to complete this unique scope of work. So such as, office space for the planning liaison or some of the utilities and supplies and professional development, which is not something that's typical in contracts with the other partners. Next slide. So attached to the committee memo were the staff recommendations for the work activities and expenses to be completed or incurred by CMAP staff and the partner agencies, including those activities that are specific to the Council of Mayors for each core category. I understand there's some concerns that some activities that have been considered core in the past don't seem to be listed in the examples in the memo. In particular, I think one that stands out is PACE's Smart Mobility Program, as well as the kind of traditional rotation of funding to the counties for the long-range planning activities. There's a few reasons why those aren't included in the activity list here. First, thinking about the county funding, while that rotation has traditionally occurred, it's really never been a guarantee that any particular county would be funded in any particular year, mainly because such a guarantee is likely to be viewed by our federal partners as a set aside, which would not be permitted. So instead, we need to make sure that we're always choosing what we fund based on the needs and the planning priorities of the region at any given time. Second, a rotating allocation doesn't really fit the core definition of funding the day-to-day activities of the MPO. And then finally, projects that have traditionally been funded for the counties are projects that maybe typically aren't completed within 1 year. In the core program in particular, activities need to be completed within a fiscal year. That's why it's focused on the ongoing staff work. So yes, that traditional rotation isn't recommended for inclusion in the core program. However, that work itself, as well as different elements of that work, are super appropriate for the competitive program. Also, the intent of the core recommendation is to concentrate on funding both CMAP staff and our partners' contributions to meeting core requirements. So thinking kind of about what the councils of mayors do, every county in the region also has at least one staff person, some have two, that complete the tip changes for county-sponsored projects, attend tip trainings, pass on CMAP information within their work. So that's work that would absolutely have to be completed by CMAP staff if the counties didn't do it, therefore could be included in the core, along with some of the data acquisition work that's done by the county staff. So I suspect that annually amounts of 50 to 75,000 is what gets spent on those core activities at the counties. And if you spread that over 7 years, which is the current rotation, that equates to at least as much, if not more, than what each county would get in the traditional rotation every 7 years. So kind of want to think about that. The intent was certainly not to eliminate that rotation, but to shift it to competitive and make sure that we're picking up the core work that the counties do. Similarly with PACE's Smart Mobility Program, Dave kind of alluded to this, talking about Metro's project, that we had a couple of years there where there wasn't a competitive program, and this was something that was really important to this committee, and then also made it through transportation and the MPO. So while it's been funded out of core, it probably belongs in competitive going forward. So moving on to the next slide. So with the eligibilities defined, staff proposes that each year the eligible agencies submit a budget estimate to CMAP staff. It could be something similar to what's on the screen here, with kind of identification of the type of personnel, their estimated hourly rates, the hours that are going to be spent on categories, along with expense estimates, kind of high level stuff, right? And do that for each of the core activities. And then these proposals will be reviewed by CMAP staff alongside of CMAP's budget to estimate for the MPO activities to develop the UWP core proposal by category. So next slide. Once approved. Yeah. Can we go to the next one? Is it turning slowly today? Okay, perfect. Sorry. Once approved by the MPO policy, or sorry, this category-based information is what will be included in the UWP document and presented to the policy committee for approval. This documents within each category, the work to be done by each agency, along with the level of effort and not to exceed costs. Once approved by the MPO policy committee, agencies would then be provided with their final scope of work for the fiscal year, including deliverables that they've committed to, and the not to exceed funding allocation from which you could then put together your detailed line by line budget for your contract documents. So kind of looking to get MPO approval of those bottom line dollars for each agency and then work out the details for the contracts in the intermediate months. CMAP's final detailed budget would be determined by the CMAP board to ensure that, as required by the MOU between the board and the MPO policy committee, that CMAP is providing adequate staff support to carry out the activities described in the UWP. Finally, just as a reminder, because I know it's been a concern in the past, the CMAP board can't budget federal metropolitan planning funds for activities that are not in the UWP, and the CMAP board could not alter the scope of work or funding allocated to partner agencies by the MPO policy committee without the MPO's approval. So just wanted to remind everyone of that. So before we move on to what we discovered in the peer review, are there questions or comments about the core recommendation?
You would go back one slide. What is the bottom half? The budget overview, what does that represent?
So that would be just what is each agency's contribution to that overall core activity? This is made up. These are completely made up numbers, sorry.
I just want to make sure. Thank you.
I should have put sample or example across in a watermark, sorry.
Yeah, Cam, just for historic purposes, the shared mobility was part of CAT's CMAP, and it was a function.
Okay.
And it was in the, I think, 2006 agreement that it was turned over to PACE.
Okay,
So it was a core function of the MPO at one time. And it was that agreement that transferred those functions over. So it wasn't as something that PACE was doing on their own. It would have been under the MPO.
and that history is not evident in past UWP documents, honestly. So
I think it's like CMAP, NIPSI documents before it came. Yeah, the CATS, NIPSI
gotcha.
formation documents.
Thinking about that is, I think based on some of the vouchers I've seen, it's mostly staff work for PACE, right?
I mean, this was what, Tom Vick,
Yeah.
it was, so it was with, you had the contract with UIC.
Mm-hmm.
So it was in that merger that we took it at over.
Okay. With that in mind, is that it doesn't neatly fit into the, required products of the MPO. I think it's maybe is something worth talking about here as a committee is, do we feel that that is a core function of the MPO, or since it's been turned over to PACE, is it not? And it maybe is not a decision that can be made today, but are there initial gut reactions to that?
Does anybody have any questions or reactions to that? I would need personally a better explanation of precisely what we were talking about. I don't know if that applies to anybody on the committee, but I think if a further discussion and more details on exactly what it is and where it may fall would be a little bit easier with more information.
We can certainly bring that to the next meeting.
Yeah, I was in a different department, so I just know enough to have the basic background of when we took it over
And I only went back about 4 or 5 UWP cycles and
this,
it looked like it was always competitive. So,
yeah.
okay. Interesting.
I kind of have a point that I'd like to that sort of builds on that. I feel like what would be helpful, at least for me, and I suspect some of the other committee members, is that when we're talking about the methodology and kind of the new updated methodology, if we represent that within the context of what's changed, and if we had some sort of record, that Dave brings up that kind of point before, this changed before, but didn't seem like there was a solid record of it. and because I know at least here at CDOT, we kind of operate on what we're used to doing. And you could send us a whole new methodology and we'd have trouble just kind of comparing and contrasting. So saying, okay, this is what changed, that would really jump out and our focus would go to that.
I would love to be able to do that. There is no methodology from the past. It's been kind of one-off year to year. So, we can pull the minutes of the last couple of rounds, but there really never was a set methodology for this committee. That's part of what we're trying to do now is set one. So we can talk about what's, happened each year via the meeting minutes, but as far as we change from this person being eligible or this type of project being eligible to now we're proposing this, we don't really have a comparison because there is no past methodology. There's just past what happened. So, and I know that like sounds flippant and terrible, but that's really kind of where we're at. So, that's one of the reasons that we're here talking about it this way is trying to get to a more documented process that the region's comfortable with. It gives us that, transparency, not only among this committee, but also for the Transportation Committee and the MPO Policy Committee, and also gives us that predictability that I know everybody here is dying to have. So, not the best answer, but that's kind of the reality that we're at. I can't quite give you what you want, but.
I almost view it as, maybe due to the lack of a charter that was revisited over time. It's like, what are we supposed to be doing? Well, let's start with the MPO requirements and kind of write those down and start building up from there is the way I interpret it. And, conversations with issues like what Dave and maybe others raised moving forward might, fit into that, function of this committee. So that's the way I view it, at least. But again, I'm maybe 2 years in.
Kama, so the counties have a lot of questions, comments, issues, obviously. What is the schedule here, for us to provide you detailed comments, thoughts, suggested, counter proposals for a variety of different aspects of this? Because I could sit here for 30 or 40 minutes documenting the things that we have concerns about, but I'd rather be able to do this, in cooperation with my peers.
I mean, to some degree, let's have as much conversation as we can today, right? That helps give staff direction. It helps the other partners in the room express their opinion on your opinion.
Yep.
But our next meeting is September 13th. So I think, if there's a substantive, if there's a big conversation that needs to happen, let's schedule something. I'm happy to come out and, speak with the county reps. I know I talked to Scott a little bit the other day and, I don't think that the comments, at least that have been conveyed so far to me are anything that we can't work through. So,
Yeah, and I think, as I have, accumulated a lot of different comments from various peer organizations, we all have some similar commentary, but there's enough, kind of a nuance to some of our comments that it deserves a conversation, I think. So.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for the benefit of the committee, maybe we can share some of the basic concerns or ideas.
Sure. Where to begin. I mean, yeah, I mean, we understand, I think the counties understand that we were never guaranteed, a position in the Corps. However, we've also been eliminated from LTA consideration. Our concern is that, you're talking to counties that represent 3.2 million people in the region with significant planning activities that are a portion of that compose a large portion of the planning activities throughout the 7-county area. So I'm really, somewhat disturbed because as we have gone on, we've said, okay, well, $250,000 per year, great. I'm, happy to have that, but many of our projects now exceed $1 million. So we're bearing a lot of the burden ourselves, and the staff, frankly, is also. So it isn't just programming activities that need to be accommodated. I spent with our LRTP process, I spent probably 2 staff years of my own accord working on that document. So there are a lot of suggestions along these lines. I mean, we also are kind of nervous about the idea of CMAP, maybe just discounting core, the counties out of the core without even talking about maybe putting parameters on the core projects such that, we would all have the same landscape to work with. I mean, so we're all looking at the same thing, same regulations and parameters. So when we go through and we submit for a project, what is it that we're actually going to have to meet in terms of CMAP standards for on to 2050 that needs to go into those projects? And then can we, ultimately as counties decide then whether or not we actually want to apply for it, or we pass it on to somebody else. I mean, these are the types of proposals that we have documented, and I'm happy to, to put these into a 3 or 4 pager for you.
Yeah, I mean, that would definitely be appreciated. And thanks for sharing those 2 concerns to start with. I think, a couple things, there is no exclusion of the counties in the LTA program. And it's my understanding, and I know Stephanie's here if she wants to chime in, we're kind of retooling that program now. It's not the LTA program anymore. It's a technical assistance program, and we're working on a program specifically for the counties. That's all I know about it at this point. But I do want to throw that out there. I think, to some of your other points, I want to make sure that we're thinking about core versus competitive here. Core being the required MPO activities. We have to fund those things first. You help us with those things. Everyone sitting at this table helps us with those things. And so it's always been our intention to fund that assistance. The other things, your long range plan, frankly, is not a core MPO activity. And so, and I mean, there's pieces of it that definitely feed into our long range plan. And I think that having the conversation about what are those pieces, and do those pieces, particularly the staff support, right? Your time in particular, John, how do those pieces fit into the core MPO work versus paying for your long range plan consultant? A consulting project that lasts 2 to 3 years isn't appropriate as part of the core budget. But I think it's very appropriate as part of the competitive budget. And I think thinking about how to break that up into the logical steps, which pieces feed directly into CMAP's work, right? When you do a long range plan and, run scenarios in your model, do those get shared with CMAP for input into our model? I don't know, I don't work in research and analysis or modeling, so I don't know for sure, but, thinking about how we share data back and forth as partners is a big part of this. Not just funding, one-offs, and not that a long range plan update or a bike ped plan update is a one-off, but, from the standpoint of getting our core activities done, it kind of is. So, but yeah, I mean, happy to sit down with all of the counties and talk through some of this.
I have a kind of a follow-up question and maybe a clarification to see if I heard your presentation right. So I guess the proposal for the core then is that the county staff that does tip changes, does planning activities, would submit on an annual basis as part of the UWP development process, just like in the Council of Mayors program right now, we put a budget together for each council and we combine that. Would the counties be combining into one? Would each county submit? But regardless of the mechanics of it, you're suggesting that the counties submit sort of a budget of staff time for those activities that they're already doing that would be funded out of the core.
Correct. Yeah, that is the intention. Just like, CDOT has a project in the core that is for tip development. PACE CTA, Metra, all have projects in the core that is for the work that they do to help with the tip. So, you know, for whatever reason, the counties have never been a part of that. You know, maybe back in the CATS days, it was decided they would do the rotating funding instead of doing that. I don't know. You know, I wasn't around for that, wasn't involved in UWP really until recently, but, you know, as again, we're trying to kind of refocus and set, you know, a better methodology for this whole process. Trying to make that line between core and competitive be a little bit clearer is really the intent, and make sure that we're recognizing everything that everybody contributes to the MPO being successful. I mean, if the MPO doesn't meet our requirements, the region loses all access to federal funding. So we need to meet our requirements, and we need to fund the things that help us meet those requirements.
So to clarify, the budget that's on display right now is simply an example.
Correct.
When it comes time to requesting core, these dollar amounts have not been set. But what each organization would be asked to do is, how much time are you spending on tips, public participation plans, congestion mitigation plans, coming to UWP committee meetings, et cetera, primarily staff time. And, you know, write those activities or deliverables down, and then associate the hours and the cost with that.
Ryan,
And
will
then
you
that
flip
would,
back one slide?
okay, that would be the that would be the budget, the core budget request
Correct,
for next year.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so the intent would be, you know, here's an individual agency's request, and exactly what you're saying, Mike, where you've got, you know, here's my personnel and here's their rate and their number of hours, here's my expenses. So this is my total in this category. And then wrapping all of that into what's on the next slide to be what the MPO approves.
Do you have a template that
Not
folks
yet.
use for that? Okay, and so you're thinking about maybe developing a template that folks could use to develop their request.
Yeah, and I mean, the Council of Mayors use one within themselves that's very similar to this. In fact, this is probably one of their sets of numbers that I use to make this example, but you know, and that's where they've kind of been doing this forever, where they have 11 councils that put together 11 individual budgets, and then they roll it up into one request. So the intent here is for all of the partner agencies to, you know, develop what they think their budget is to complete the core work, and then CMAP would roll all of that up into one package for the MPO Policy Committee to approve those bottom line numbers.
Yeah, just building on what Kama said, this is what the council does. So we by staff position of who's working on our scope of work that is approved as the PL program. We put a budget together for staff for those things that Kama mentioned. Some councils, it's rent and utilities for their space. Some it's just staff, some it's, you know, a combination, but all of those get detailed out in a very specific budget and then rolled up into the council's core request.
Thank you. And then to John's question earlier, our next meeting is in September. And so it sounds like some things need to be discussed between now and September, and then between September and when will sort of the budget discussions and agreements happen?
Yeah, so we're scheduled to meet in September and November, and I think, you know, well, it's, you know, next steps is later in this, in the slide, but it's, you know, seems like maybe we want to either add an August meeting or add an October meeting to make sure that we give ourselves enough time to be at the point where we're developing the core budget in November, and then rolling the competitive to follow that, which we still have a lot more to talk about on the competitive, so.
That's fair. I just, you know, when we're really doing a lot of work on the part, you know, issues presently, and obviously there are a lot of meetings being scheduled around the, you know, one-on-ones around there. So if there are opportunities for us to kind of marry those two together, discussions.
Yep.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah, and I think county engineers just had a meeting, didn't they? So I can't piggyback on. Do they have a meeting scheduled for August?
Well, we have a county one-on-one scheduled for August, but I mean, there are other opportunities in the next month and a half or two.
Yeah, we'll definitely, I don't want to add another day of travel around the region for everybody, so we'll try and piggyback
Yeah.
on something for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's same goes for me.
If I could chime in, I recognize that, putting a methodology in place where there was no methodology is a little tricky. So I think, we want your input and we want your feedback, and we want to put this together with you so that, as a unified work program, we're on a unified front with this. So we're trying to put together a methodology. We recognize we might be putting together a methodology this year and improving upon it next year. We'll see what has worked and what could be better. And we want to improve on it year over year. So we want to try to put parameters in place for the core program, in part so that the competitive program can be better and can be better utilized. So hopefully that'll be clear when we talk about the peer review next in this agenda, and then talk about some of our ideas for the competitive program. But we do want to make this better with you all and work with you to make sure that A, the methodology makes sense, and B, that it works for all of us.
For sure, Alex, and thanks for that. I think, as we've reformed methodologies across other funding programs over the last, several years, it's always easier if staff throws something out there, even if everybody hates it, it's something to talk about, and we can work through it. So, that's what we're doing. I'm standing up here throwing something out, and it definitely is, not the law or the rule or anything else. It's out there to give us something to talk about. So, any other comments, questions on the core? If not, I'll let Noah come up and talk about the results of the peer review.
Hey everyone, I'm Noah. Can you hear me okay? Next slide. So CMAP staff conducted a UWP peer scan to develop an understanding of both the state of practice and best practices related to UWP development. The UWP peer review was conducted in 2 phases. The first phase was a broad scan of 21 peer MPOs UWPs, only based on information and documents available online. The second phase was comprised of virtual interviews with a subset of those peer MPOs from phase 1 to allow for deeper engagement and specific questions for the interviewees. The attached table 1 and 2 in the agenda packet show the agencies reviewed for each peer scan phase. During the initial scan, staff used the following research questions to identify the state of practice and best practices for UWP development. The research questions focus specifically on if and how peer MPOs may award UWP funds to external agencies, and those were: does the MPO award funds to external agencies? What types of external plans and studies are funded? What is the process of awarding UWP funds? What committees, if any, are involved in the process? How is performance of UWP funded external projects measured and tracked? And finally, what is the public engagement process? So of the agencies reviewed, about 1/3 appeared to award funds to external agencies. External plans and studies are typically focused on transportation projects, neighborhood or area level studies, such as local complete streets studies or other specific programs related to long-range plan goals. The level of documentation detailing the process of awarding, tracking, and conducting public engagement for externally funded projects varies greatly. Several MPOs use a committee to guide the project selection process, and some use committees to conduct engagement and solicit public input. the most common method through which MPOs track progress of external projects is through progress reports, usually quarterly. Next slide. So this slide shows the 4 MPOs we interviewed for phase 2 of the peer scan. Those were Baltimore Regional Transportation Board, Denver Regional Council of Governments, Boston Region MPO, and the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. Next slide. So based on phase 1 of the review in June of early this summer, CMAP staff conducted interviews with the 4 selected MPOs. These agencies represented a diversity of approaches when working with external partners through the UWP development process. On the slide here are the interview questions we used to guide our discussions with those MPOs. Summaries of each of those interviews are included as attachments in the agenda packet. Those questions were, do you award UWP funds to external agencies through a competitive program? And if so, what are the parameters? What reporting requirements do you have in place for UWP funded external projects? Do you have any data sharing recommendations or requirements? What is your level of participation in UWP funded external projects, and how do you ensure that you have a seat at the table for those projects? And then finally, do you award funds to partner agencies to participate in the regional planning process? And if so, what are the benefits and drawbacks? Next slide. So this is my last slide here. These peer scan interviews, they allowed for quite focused discussions, which helped to inform new ideas for CMAP's proposed competitive program. We'll talk more about some of those ideas in the next section of this agenda item. The scan and the interviews also reaffirmed that funding regional cooperation and collaboration through a competitive program is desirable, and together with a strong core, we can ensure a comprehensive regional transportation planning environment. CMAP staff intends to continue engaging with the peer MPOs, the 4 we spoke to and the others, as they also evolve their UWP development processes to allow for ongoing identification of best practices for consideration through the committee. Before we move on to talking about some of those ideas we identified in the interviews, I'm available for any questions.
Just a question on so I'm kind of fuzzy about how we define external projects. How are external projects being defined within both the CMAC context and the peer context? Are they the same?
Yeah, I think, John, that was part of really what the peer review kind of revealed is, the vast majority of MPOs view the the federal metro planning funds as for use by the MPO only. I think we found, and Noah, correct me if I'm wrong, that, external projects are really at other MPOs more like our technical assistance program, where the MPO is procuring a consultant on behalf of a county or a regional council, a transit agency, something like that. So, from our perspective, you all are external to us, but it's been the tradition in the region. And as we just talked about with the core, right, you have a role in the MPO process. And that seems to be unique to CMAP. There are other MPOs out there, including the 4 that we talked to, and you see it in the details in the memo that, are trying to do more like our technical assistance program, and including, larger projects. Our technical assistance program has been focused on kind of smaller, individualized projects, and some of the technical assistance we saw with some of the peer MPOs was more about helping with long range plans or doing a large, transit study, things that are done pretty regularly here, right? So, external really in the context of the peer review means anybody outside of the MPO. Good stuff.
All right.
Yeah, and I would just add briefly on that point. In at least 1 or 2 of the interviews we had, some of those external projects the MPO really prioritized funding projects that could be utilized by multiple municipalities or were regional in nature in some way.
For sure.
Anybody else have any other questions? Thank you. Are we going to core next or competitive next? Sorry.
Emma, I think your mic might be off.
Thank you. Green, okay, green is good. Uh, So kind of shifting away from core to competitive, talking about the core, we're much stronger recommendations from staff. Everything from this point on is really just an idea. So please take it as such. I tried to put proposed or possible on all the slides. If it's not there, that's what's meant. So, everybody here has conducted a call for projects or has participated in responding to a call for projects. And, with each call for projects, we kind of look for a certain set of things, right? Who's eligible to apply? How much funding is available? Is that funding limited by a project or by a sponsor? What's the timeline, both of the call itself as well as the program being developed? What activities are eligible? And how are projects evaluated? What's that process and what are the scoring criteria? The who for our UWP competitive program is probably the same as our core program, maybe with the addition of individual municipalities or small groups of municipalities. It could be, a group, 1 or 2 counties, or a county and a transit agency. And then staff thinks that the how much for our competitive program is probably a minimum of 75,000 federal, because that's about how much it would take to make it worthwhile to go through the contracting process. And then up to a maximum of 750,000 per project. So why 750K? Next slide, which you're already at, sweet. So 750K because that would be a significant portion of the annual budget, but not all of it. Executive Director Alaman has committed to designating for the competitive program the entire 2.5% that's required for safe and complete streets funding, as well as an additional 500,000 each fiscal year. So that brings us to anywhere from $1 million to $2 million. That 2.5% set aside is about 600,000 to 800,000. It does grow a little bit over time as our allotment grows. So I feel comfortable saying a minimum of $1 million for sure. It's probably closer to $1.5 million. So these amounts are something that would of course be revisited annually. We get an annual allotment from IDOT that's based on an apportionment from federal highway and federal transit. Totally lost my train of thought. The complete streets funding. We've talked a lot about that over the last couple cycles, right? That's something that kind of came out of left field with the IIJA. Oh my God, we have to spend 2.5% of our funding on these types of activities. So, CMAP staff really feels like these are activities that you all do with the work that you do. It's more than just bike ped planning. It's more than just safety planning. It's about all of these things here on the slide. Access to transit and increasing transit ridership. So most of the competitive work that we've done over the years fit into these categories. So I don't think that, getting enough competitive projects to use up that 2.5% is going to be a burden at all. And then also just making sure that we've got a significant chunk for things that don't fit this, which I have a hard time thinking that we wouldn't fit into these categories. But so that's the good news and the guarantee and the promise. That's the one piece of factual information that's not an idea under this competitive portion of this. So thinking then about what would a schedule be for developing a competitive program. staff thinks that doing a call for projects every other year, similar to our other funding programs, makes a lot of sense. You know, developing a program takes time. For whatever reason, UWP, we've always crammed into a small number of months, and that makes it hard. And it also doesn't, you know, help with people planning ahead, right? So we also think that building out a 5-year program of projects makes sense. By building out a multi-year program, sponsors have assurances, not guarantees, but strong assurances that funding for their planning project is coming and when it's coming. This could also have a tremendous impact on, you know, one of the issues we've talked about here a lot with procurement, right? If you know that your project is coming up for funding 2 years from now, then you can get started with your procurement a little bit earlier. You know, as with other funding programs, we would need to make adjustments between call cycles. Things like what we talked about with the Metro project, right? You know, priorities have shifted, conditions have shifted. If we've got a multi-year program of projects, we have the ability to shuffle those things around. So the other thing that we can do is be a lot more thoughtful about how projects can progress and be useful to multiple partners. For example, you know, imagine if in the first year of a multi-year program, we collected transit boarding and alighting data. And then in years 2 and years 3, the counties or a group of municipalities got together and did access to transit plans using that data instead of going out and recollecting their own data for their own sub area. And then in year 4, that feeds into the next study. So it lets us be more thoughtful. So I think next slide. Somehow my pages are reversed. Okay. So I just gave some examples of studies or projects that could be appropriate for consideration because they would result in deliverables that can be used by the sponsor and by CMAP, which is something that, you know, we heard in the peer review that others are doing when they do give away funding to others, is that, you know, we're spending metropolitan planning funds that are for MPO activities, and you know, sometimes those deliverables don't ever show back up here at CMAP, and they really should. So, you know, our competitive projects should include studies that are conducted with in-house staff or consultants, as well as one-time data collection or purchase. But again, those should be able to be used by the sponsor and by CMAP, if not by everyone else in the region too. So, so these are pretty broad things. How do we select the right mix of projects? On the next slide. Is really some potential scoring criteria that I need the list. It's coming. We're still working the kinks out in our meeting rooms. I'll go with the tiny print. All right, so potential scoring criteria, and this is in the memo, so you should hopefully have, some of you have that in front of you, are things that advance CMAC's strategic direction, which focuses on transportation, climate, and regional economy. There we go. Addressing federal planning factors, influencing upcoming statewide planning efforts. So the state does a statewide bike plan, a statewide freight plan, other things. How can we make sure that we're doing the work locally so that we can influence those statewide plans? Addressing issue areas identified by CMAP to inform the next plan. Those are conversations we're having now. What are the research topics for the next long range plan? To what degree can deliverables be used by others? And how can we increase cost effectiveness, efficiency, and reduce redundancies in the region? So the first thing on this list, advancing our strategic direction, might be a little broad or subjective, but I think you know, the others on this list could easily lend themselves to a point structure, either as a yes, no, or to some count or degree. For example, you know, getting a point for each federal planning factor that's addressed by a project. For the deliverables, maybe it's, you know, you get 3 points if your deliverable can be used by, you know, at least one other partner, and 5 points if it can be used by more, and 0 points if it can only be used by you and CMAP. You know, maybe the more subjective criteria are the ones that get debated and voted on by this committee, and then this committee's points this committee's votes get interpreted into points. So just some ideas. Really, nothing magic here, trying to throw out something for folks to talk about. So I'll stop running my mouth and just looking for gut reactions to some of that.
So there's going to be a competitive program. Does anybody have any comments or questions on the presentation and some of the framework pieces for how that program would be implemented?
So Cam, so the Complete Streets funding is open for doing the competitive program, because that was kind of not clear in the memo. So that,
Yeah.
that funds would be available for, eligible for
Yeah.
any of the sponsors. And I guess the other thing, in the memo, it said individual local governments, but you listed municipalities.
It could be either.
Okay.
You're right. I didn't match the words in the
Because
memo, did
local
I?
governments, I'm thinking park districts and, where do you end? It,
Local governments was really meant to encompass municipalities and counties. But you're right.
'cause
We use local governments and other funding programs to
like
include park
CMAQ
districts,
gives
yeah,
a lot more
Yeah.
eligibility. Okay.
which is probably not. I don't want to say it's not appropriate in the UWP competitive program, but it's definitely less appropriate. I can't see a park district leading a large planning study. Right.
Do you normally require matching funds for competitive program applications?
Yes.
Okay. The reason I ask that is because there's a couple of references to MPO requirements for complete streets and in the last highway authorization. And then there is actually a small amount of funding that comes with a different function code that's kind of labeled complete streets.
It's,
So, and I'll just go there. That funding is actually 100% federal. And because of that, and because of the fact that IDOT has been providing state matching funds to all the MPOs and a bunch of SPR projects, rather than distribute that 2.5% to MPOs, we've made a decision in coordination, and we brought it up a few times with the MPOs, that we're going to take that and we're going to put it on some projects and avoid the complexity of multiple function codes on a single agreement. So we may want to have a conversation about the way we're referring to the 2.5%, so there's no confusion. If competitive program applicants are putting up match anyway, doesn't really matter. You could use normal Metro PL versus the 2.5%, 100% federal Metro PL. I think we've already put most of that onto either ADA transition plan support or SS4A. So before we got too far in this, the one thing guaranteed is that 2.5%. I wanted to clarify that there's a couple of references, and before, if there's assumptions going on that the funds that that we've already kind of decided to put somewhere else are being talked about, we need to have one of those other side conversations between now and September.
I don't know why they made the two numbers the same, right? The 2.5%.
I think there's a couple places it's in there, and I apologize. I'm trying to confirm with Denver or Brandon, is that the money we just spent?
No, the
So-
intention was to take 2.5% of our regular metro planning funds.
Okay.
It happens to be the same number for the same types of, or similar types of activities for sure, but no, trying to meet the MPOs are required to spend at least 2.5% of their metro planning funds on this list of things. We think that our partners are in a better space to do those things, and so we want to make sure that 2.5% of our metropolitan planning funds are
Okay.
dedicated for our partners to do those activities. Cool.
Yeah, it had come up a few times already, so I figured I better
Yep.
bring it up, or I'd hear later on, why didn't I mention something when I had a microphone right in front of me, so.
Yes, we will rephrase that to be 2.5% of the region's metro planning allotment, or something along those lines, to clarify that it's not that set aside amount of funding.
Maybe following up on that, we were discussing, or we had the question, why this funding for the streets or for the safe streets, why is it coming from the core activity? Why is it not coming from the core activities, but from the competitive funds? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the last 2 cycles, it's been a part of the core, and CMAP has just set that aside for CMAP activities. Did not include it in, well, we ended up not doing competitive, but you know, didn't even entertain sharing that, so to speak. So you know, I think that we've come to the realization that our partners are better suited to do kind of that work. You know, we spent a lot of time on that work over the last 2 years, and, you know, certainly used that 2.5% over these last 2 years to do that work. But moving forward, it makes more sense to seed the competitive program with that funding. So, and again, it's a pretty broad list of work. It's not just safe and complete streets, it's access to transit, it's, you know, building transit ridership. There was a lot in that list. So again, most of the competitive projects that we've done in the past fit into that scope of work. So and it, you know, in some ways helps us with our accounting in being able to separate that out in the UWP document, as here are all of these studies that our partners are doing that are helping us meet that requirement. So
Maybe just this follow-up for understanding. So the sustainability plan we presented earlier would fall under this category?
I believe that it does. Look at that. Integrate sidewalks, bikeways, trails. Yeah. I think some of it would, for sure. You know, we honestly would have to confirm it with Federal Highway and FTA that sustainability meets those requirements. I think it does because it's transit related. But you know, I think we'd have to get an opinion on that for sure. Yeah, I'm not the one that gets to make that decision. Yeah, Christine.
Yeah, just want to ask if there was any background thinking about opening up the program to individual local governments rather than just the committee members.
I think, you know, there have been in particular groups of local governments that have gotten together. The councils have, you know, an individual council has put in a competitive application to do things like a council-wide bike ped plan or a council-wide transit plan. You know, I think years ago, probably a decade ago at this point, some of the DuPage transit study used some UWP funding, I believe. So it was more focused on thinking about that, making sure that we're not saying it has to be the 11 councils have to collectively put in a competitive application, that it could be a smaller group or even an individual municipality. I mean, there are certainly individual municipalities out there that are large enough to do a large scale, geographically large enough or population large enough.
Would CMAP be counseling applicants like who might be better suited for LTA program funding versus what this is, you know, pointing more towards MPO activities and implementation of
Yeah,
that?
for sure. I think, you know, it's definitely one. I think the calls will always not be in sync. There's probably some things out there that would be eligible in either program. But I don't think we don't want to get into a situation where people are taking the same project and applying in multiple funding programs. Let's work with everybody to find the most appropriate funding program, right? There's going to be some projects, and there always have been, right, that apply for UWP funding that are more appropriate for SPR funding and that have been funded that way. So, you know, it's on us really as staff of the MPO and, you know, you guys as our partners and with the inside knowledge to help guide people to the right programs. So yeah, for sure. I think we would prepare lots of things to say this is the right place for your project. Staff doesn't want to evaluate projects that are inappropriate for one program or another. So
Just to add to that, because I know some other folks have their hands raised. Part of also, the reasoning behind it is that historically we have, distributed funds to local governments, but also in the peer interviews, we found that other MPOs were distributing funds to like broader, populations than just the committee members. But that they were prioritizing basically sub-regional studies where, say, a group of municipalities gets together. Sometimes it could be through a council of mayors or other COG, but it could be a different kind of subset of local governments that would basically present a case for a study that would be really useful sub-regionally. It could also be really useful for the MPO as a whole. And they've agreed to work together on this study across, say, 6 or 7 municipalities. So that was one of the things that we wanted to consider. And then also, add scoring criteria so that if it's a study that has a benefit to multiple jurisdictions, it could get higher points in the scoring criteria. So it was just one of the ideas we floated, in part based on the interviews with the peer MPOs.
And I think that last point that Alex made about making sure that, particularly through the UWP, that we're considering things that benefit more than one municipality, where, the regular technical assistance program is more focused on an individual municipality. So I think that scoring criteria alone probably, I don't want to say weeds out, because I don't want to weed anybody out. But
Gets them in the appropriate place.
yeah, put everybody in the appropriate place. Yeah. And give them the right level of attention. So. Like,
just over the years, the council of mayors has had concerns with the competitive program. I think this proposal addresses a lot of the concerns that the council has had, council mayors as a whole. I think having a sort of a known pot of the competitive program is great, really important. It was always kind of year to year unknown. Is it going to be $200,000 this year? Is it going to be $1 million? And in those years where it was 200,000, why are we going through the effort of, putting scopes and proposals and studies together? So, I think having a call every 2 years is a good cadence that works for our other programs. Having a multi-year program, I think, will provide good stability for being able to plan ahead and get, like you mentioned, the procurement, getting consultants on board for these things. So I think there's a lot of things in here that kind of resolve some of the concerns that the council of mayors has had over years of the competitive program. So I think we're on the right track, at least for some of the concerns we've had in the past.
Do you see complete streets as being kind of a sustaining topic within this competitive program, or are we thinking more along the lines of the STP regional part 2 here, where we switch our topical areas, from 2-year period to 2-year period?
I think it could be a combo. I mean, it's not, saying that we need to spend X amount of dollars every year because of the IIJA on a certain set of activities. And, we're looking for your help to do that. Does that mean that all of the competitive program needs to be concentrated on those activities? No. Is it possible that whatever scoring mechanism we come up with leans heavily toward that this cycle, and then we have, just as we do with STP, CMAC, on the in-between years when we're not doing a call for projects, we discuss our methodology and we discuss our scoring criteria. And so I would envision that same thing happening here, right? If complete streets, if bike ped, even not just the complete streets requirements, but if bike ped was a focus in the first cycle, we might say, okay, for the next cycle, we're going to award more points for something else, but that wouldn't be, I don't see it going rotating. I mean, it's too hard to predict that. That's the conclusion we came to in talking about the STP shared fund, was lumping topics by year just didn't make sense. It makes more sense to have a range of things that are eligible all the time. We have more than one priority for sure. And we should be trying to address all of those priorities all the time. Do those priorities shift over time? Absolutely. And that's why you revisit your methodology on a regular basis.
And to add to that, where we are in our planning cycle might impact a certain year. So if we're, about to publish a long range plan, our needs are different than if we're published one 3 years ago or getting ready to write one. One thing she included in there is like, what are the state plans that we're looking to support? Is there a freight plan in 2 years or did we just finish one? So that might impact how well something scores. But it would be sort of consistent otherwise.
And I think that's to that point, thinking about the county plan updates, right? How do we fit those into our long range plan cycle? I always struggle with the chicken and egg on that. Which one comes first, the regional plan or the county plans? And it's the reality is it's this kind of revolving process, right? Same thing with the asset management plans and strategic plans for the transit agencies. How does that fit in with when we're in develop a new long range plan versus a long range plan update cycle? So Martin's absolutely right. I think the kind of activities we're trying to time out in our multi-year plan may shift a little bit each time, but I think the topics that are of concern to this region are the topics that are of concern to this region. So.
Yeah, when I was looking at this, just the fact that your scoring criteria includes the CMAP, strategic direction, federal planning factors, things like that. There's a lot of project types that could qualify for that and score well in this program is the way I interpreted it. And I was kind of also thinking that, the complete streets language has gotten several people's attention. So when it says you're going to spend at least $1 million, including the 2.5% complete streets funding, that might be there almost because that money fits in that number pretty well. And I think most of us that have looked at that know that, CMAP might spend 50% of their funding on things that could qualify for complete streets. So it's kind of an interesting, pretty easy to meet new federal requirement. But anyway, it looks like you're looking for projects that are sort of pulling in the same direction as you are, that are things that partner agencies need to get done and are looking for funding for. So anyway, go ahead, Buck. Sorry.
No, had not.
All the questions thus far have been pretty specific. I'm going to get a bit meta, if you don't mind. I feel like we've been presented with a toolbox of interesting ideas, best practices, solutions, but when tools are presented to me, or solutions, my response is, well, what's the problem? And I mean, what are the barriers to success for UWP, for core, for competitive? Are certain county interests being left out? Are cities falling through the cracks because they don't have the organizational capacity? Are projects not being in deadlines so people do not understand what projects are relevant? And we did great. This is great work in kind of understanding the best practices outside, from other parallel or relevant organizations. But I feel like we all kind of have an idea of what our own single issue is as CDOT, as counties, mayors, PACE, RTA, whatever. We all have an idea of what our problem is, but I don't think we have a collective understanding of what we're all kind of facing together. And of course, it's imperative and hugely valuable that we're creating a methodology, kind of moving from a codified methodology or to a codified methodology from sort of ad hoc practice, but I think it'd be really valuable to have almost a sister memo, to this kind of, addressing at least the big issues that we're all facing together.
Yeah. And I think we talked about some of that, at the last meeting, maybe didn't put it into the memo format, but, we need to refocus on what the MPO is doing and what the purpose of this program is. The UWP are federal metro planning funds, federal highway and FTA funds, for completing federal requirements. Part of the federal process is this expansion of transportation planning studies and, you know, traditionally here, we've always, you know, tried to fund as many of our partners programs as possible. You know, that said, I think over the last couple cycles and, you know, the staffing has changed, the makeup of the committee has changed, and we've just kind of been drifting a little bit. So having a methodology to refocus that is really the intent. So it's not to say that there was a big problem, but making sure that one doesn't crop up, you know, and this is, you know, frankly, Cam is speaking here, protecting all of you, making sure that you remain a part of this program, right? It would be pretty easy for the MPO to say, nope, we're going to spend all of this funding on MPO staff. That's what's done most other places in the country. And so, you know, by all of us coming together and putting a methodology on paper, we make sure that we are keeping the practices that are tradition here.
I was just gonna bring up, we've heard a few comments on core and on competitive also. What are the next steps in this so that we can get something pulled together by September, and then for competitive at least be lined up for programming cycle?
Yeah, so conveniently, there's a slide. One more. So I think this looks hauntingly familiar to last meeting, but our next meeting is scheduled for September 13th. The hope, I think, is that staff can, you know, kind of take what we heard today and try to bring forward for discussion a methodology, you know, including what we talked about for core, but also, you know, getting some more definitions, suggesting some points, suggesting some policies for the competitive program for discussion in September, assuming that we can, you know, have some of the side conversations that it seems like we need to have between now and then, so that we're, you know, can hopefully do a call in the late September, early October timeframe for core budgets. And then also, you know, looking towards, I would say, really probably more realistically November to issue the call for the competitive program, so that over the winter we can put together those programs to bring into the you know, it is late in the afternoon for me, sorry. Bring together the UWP document for the MPO's consideration in hopefully January, but absolutely by March, to fits IDOT's development schedule. Unless you're going to change it on us again.
Go December. So to clarify, the September 13 meeting staff recommendation, would that be something that would be an action item for this committee to vote on?
I think we would advertise it as such so that we could vote on it if we came to consensus at that meeting, but I don't think that we have to take action on it.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure, you know, everybody was at least thinking about the fact that, you know, it'd be great to get comfy with something by September 13th. And if that doesn't happen, it could, you know, sort of condense some of the schedule that happens afterwards.
For sure. And I mean, you know, the proposal here is, or the idea here is, you know, to have a multi-year program, but, you know, for the next fiscal year, we really only need the next fiscal year's program. So that gives us a little bit of wiggle room to set up this multi-year competitive process. So let's keep that in mind too.
Sorry, I still had some questions before we skipped ahead to this.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's
I'm
okay.
sorry.
I had these questions too, but it was,
Okay.
I had some other ones before that. Yeah, so I feel like the majority of our questions were about the contracting process proposed here, and there weren't any slides about it. So I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add about that, or I could just say my piece?
Yeah, I think part of why I didn't put it into the slide presentation was, it's not as well thought out as some of the other stuff. That's probably why there's questions, but, wanted to talk about the things that we talked about today more. We've talked, Penny presented, it was Penny, right? Or Alex presented, Alex, you did it at the last meeting about reporting and just making sure that we're keeping things on schedule. On the core side, having 1-year contracts is pretty important. On the competitive side, I think that we can sit down and work with IDOT on, how can we structure our contracts so that if we had to cut them off after a year, we can, but how to structure them so that they fit into those multiple fiscal years. But letting things, getting an award this year and not starting it for 2 years, that's, we need to step away from that. So getting something programmed this year for 2 years from now gives us that 2 years to start that. So, keeping the contracts tighter by doing multi-year programming is the intent.
So, understanding all of that, just something for the committee to consider for people who are around in 2021. We talked about this over the course of several meetings when we were talking about changes that we could make to the program at that point in time. And one of this suggestion came up, and the folks on this committee kind of explained over and over again that this just wasn't our reality in getting our contracts procured, and that would be a real hardship on us to try to do something like do a procurement and a project in 1 fiscal year, which it seems like what this is recommending.
It is recommending that, but it's also recommending that because we're talking multi-year programming, if you're programmed to start your project, say in fiscal year 25, you would do your procurement in 24. Right? So that you are ready to execute with your consultant on day 1 of 25.
I would just be curious how other people.
Because I guess, it says procurement within 1 month of the MPO policy committee, and then you're talking December and then maybe March. And for us to get a project going means we'd have to take it to the board, our board approval in May to get ready to have it ready for, say it was July 24. But then you only get 1 year fiscal year, which means you have to be wrapped up by June 25, which means you already lost a month if we don't get the contract within 28 days. And for us to enter a procurement without the funding grant is very difficult. We'd have to change policies and to enter it into our system, we don't have the funding yet.
I get that.
So that, and if we're talking from March to May to get this done, it's just really, I understand speeding up the system. Waiting for 2 years should not happen. But there has to be some reasonable accommodation for how realistic procurement processes take. And even a year project, to get something wrapped up, and then reviews and final edits and getting final payment bill invoices in within a year by that June 30th, it's John, projects we're going out there.
I get it, Dave. We have the same thing with our projects.
In many of the
have
counties
to wrap
actually now go through QBS processes that take literally months before we can actually select a consultant. So, it just doesn't work for us.
I understand that, but we also can't encumber money today for this year that you're not going to spend until next year. We have to spend our money in the year that we get it.
Have you given any thought to, I remember this conversation and it was tricky, and we see it a little bit on the SPR side because we see a pretty broad array of procurement processes that different organizations have, and that's the way they operate and that kind of thing. But at the same time, from a programming perspective, you do want to get these projects moving. is there any possibility to do a multi-year where they're gonna take a year to get through procurement, so maybe you could program them in a year, and then they've got funding they could point to, and they could start in hopes that, you know, that they're able to get underway when that fiscal year kicks in, and then you could do the fast movers, you know, in the early years, that kind of thing.
That's the intent of the multi-year program.
okay.
Is exactly that. And if it's not coming across that way, well, let's work on the language. But that really is the intent, to say, you know, you're set to be funded in FY 25, so start your procurement ahead of that whenever you need to. We're promising you that money. The final official approval isn't gonna come until that year, because the UWP document is only 1 year at a time. That's is what it is. There's nothing CMAP can do about that.
Yeah, I know, but in the document, it was that clear.
Okay,
So if
if it's
you're-
not reading that way, yeah, let's work
Yeah,
on the
it's
language.
Confusing and it
Yep,
read.
yep.
If your
Yep.
1
project
year.
is scheduled further out, it would be these deadlines around MPO and policy committee would be for later years, not the year that you are notified of
Correct.
funding.
Correct.
So I think just to like illustrate an example, say we have a 5-year program. I have a project that I know is going to be an 8-month procurement. I'm going to ask that it be included not in our FY 25 work plan, but in our FY 26 work plan. I'll take the 8 months to do the procurement, and I'll say that the start date of that project will be at the beginning of FY 26. And that funding will be promised, it'll be approved by the MPO policy committee, and we'll see that in the 5-year work plan. If there's another project that's staff-led that another agency can do, doesn't require procurement, that can go in year 1 of the 5-year work plan. So that is how we intend to do it, because that was the procurement hurdle we heard from everyone. It's also what we heard in the MPO peer review. So that was one of the things that they recommended, is doing, if you do a multi-year program, basically schedule the projects to start, schedule them to get funding when they get the procurements. And then the 1-year deadline that we're talking about in the memo, and I recognize it might not be clearly written, is really for project phases. So you need to have 1-year increments for your project. So you could say, like, this is a 1-year phase of the project that would get this funding. This is a 1-year phase of the project that would get this funding, not necessarily 3 discrete projects. This is what happens when we look at stuff, you know, in a little circle too much. We need like outside editors to review these things, but that's our fault.
So really, like, the first year is where you're gonna have that issue of
Correct.
getting it jump started, and then once you get the multi-year, then you're set in the schedule. Okay.
And I'm hopeful we have enough staff-led projects among all of us to get us through that first year's hurdle, right?
Okay, thank you.
And then just on that, prior years, we had been counseled to not include staff-led time in the competitive program. So that seems like a change to me.
I think that it was always maybe not so much about staff-led in the competitive, but keeping consultant stuff out of the core. Kiama's opinion is, and the suggestion here is that staff work, the core should be staff work, the competitive could be either.
Okay, that's just, thanks
I
for
mean,
that
I
clarification.
think-
We had not been operating under that assumption. We were told consultant only for competitive funding, so,
Times are changing.
okay.
I would say as
Noted.
someone who loves having staff lead work instead of consultants, we do not have to use consultants for competitive projects. We recognize that a lot of times we have to use consultants because of limitations, but no, I think really it's to create that distinction between the competitive and the core.
Thanks.
Yeah, because it's hard to procure a consultant, and, you know, if it makes it easier on everybody to use UWP funding for the staff work and use your own funding to do the consultant, yeah, why wouldn't we do that? The important thing is getting the work done.
Are there any other questions for Kama on core peer reviewer competitive program?
I'm gonna throw one
No,
question out.
Maybe
I'll-
just like to also like mention for the protocol, we totally second what CG and Base brought up when it comes to the timing, and maybe you just want to clarify that in the end it's the 2 years, right? So we have 2 fiscal years to the project completion, just to add that in the memo or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna have to, I've got to get IDOT to tell me in writing that I can do a 2-year contract. Stare down. Yeah. I don't want to put in writing that it's okay if they're gonna tell us at the last minute, no. So, and I understand it's not your decision to make. That's something that that's a statewide decision. It's not all about CMAP in this case, so.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd want to hear a little bit more of what the issue is and we can sort of figure out what's a CMAP UWP thing versus what can CMAP contract for and how do we describe it in the UWP year by year?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
I mean, I guess part of it is, and maybe, you know, those of you that do budgeting at your agencies can help. I mean, how do you deal with a multi-year project in your budget? Because your budget is only 1 year, right? How do you phrase that? That makes everybody comfortable.
We can put this on the short list of things to do by September 13th.
I've got nothing else on my calendar.
Well, we have less than 10 minutes left today, and I guess I was hoping to see if there's any more questions. And then we're gonna have to move on to other business.
I want to throw one out for the committee. Is there any critical scoring criteria that you think really should be in competitive? And I don't have to have an answer today. Shoot me an email as you're eating dinner tonight and something pops into your head, whatever. But something to think about. You know, part of that proposal on the 13th is going to have to include a scoring structure. And so having to rework potential math because I didn't consider somebody's great idea would be a bummer.
Fair enough. So looking for any critical items to be included in the potential scoring criteria ASAP. All right.
In addition to what's listed here.
Or if you really only like one of these and hate the rest, let me know. That's fine.
Okay, well, let's move on to other business. Do any members of the committee have any new business to bring up? Hearing none, we're going to move to public comment. I don't believe there's anybody in the room in person. Is there anybody online who has entered a comment or would like to now?
We haven't received any comments yet.
Okay. Well, hearing none, we're going to move on to item 8, next meeting scheduled for September 13th, 2023. And we will move on to adjournment then. Let's see here. If you didn't sign in before we started the meeting, please do so. And there being no other business,
Mike, would that be 1 o'clock at the time? Do we know?
I believe so, 1
Okay.
o'clock.
Thanks.
Yep. It was on here. I missed it.
Just said September 13th.
No, on mine. They make me a little extra
Your clip notes.
extra one that anyway. So thank you for that clarification. 1 PM, September 13th. And I guess with that, we'll move on to adjournment. Can we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
And a second?
Second, Dave Tamzik.
All right. With all in favor for adjournment, vote aye. Opposed, nay.
Aye.
All right, we're adjourned. Thank you.